As we're continuing our conversations, what we're doing essentially is dealing with a fundamental question, which I hope can be understood as lying at the very foundation of understanding what therapy and the world of therapy is all about. And I think it's very important to understand what this dimension of us humans is in order to understand how it contributes to the question of therapy and the emotional lives and so on that we would like to live. So that's why I call this essentially learning life. Now, in our last talk, I compared us to the animal world and above all to those elephants that took 14 years to learn to be themselves. And what I hope that does is establishes a context for learning something about the way we humans are. Now, I would argue that we humans opted a long, long time ago for learning, to be learners. And I really must repeat that I want that word learning to be understood as multidimensional. I don't want it to be simply understood as an intellectual kind of learning or anything of that sort. It includes that, but it doesn't end there. It isn't limited by that. Now, if you think about it, compare us to the other animals that share this planet. For example, we do not have the eyesight of an eagle. We do not have the speed of a cheetah. We do not have the ability of a polar bear with its black skin and long fur to be snug and warm in the ice cold of the Arctic. We don't have the cool of a cockatoo with its feathers to be cool in the Amazon forest. We don't have the raw killing power of a lion when it strikes to create prey for itself and get its food. We don't have any one of those individual characteristics. But if you think about the history of us humans on this planet, you realize that we can see a devil of a lot further than any eagle can. In fact, we can look into galaxies that are hundreds and hundreds of light years away and see something. We can spot something on the other side of the world if we need to, because we've learned how to do it. We can be a lot more lethal than any lion can, and we are routinely that way, never mind toward the lions, but often towards one another. We can be cool in the Arctic and go up there and compete with the polar bears if we have to. We could be warm in the Amazon and so on. You see my point. In other words, essentially, we have opted for a kind of flexibility, a kind of ability to learn, a kind of ability to adapt and take in the situation in which we are and do something about it, learn something about it, change something about it. And that's essentially what we humans are. Now, if this is true, and I believe it is, then it implies that the kind of learning that you and I do as human beings is extremely complex, is multidimensional, and must be understood clearly if we're going to understand essentially how you and I are going to learn, like those elephants did, to learn to live our lives. And that's essentially what I'm driving at here. Now, what stands in the way of our understanding this is, believe it or not, an idea, a concept, which on the whole is regarded favorably. And we do not realize that it's historically determined. Essentially, what I'm referring to here is the concept of childhood. Few of us realize that that idea, that concept of what a child is, a human child, was essentially invented in the 19th century. If you look in the portrait gallery in London, where you have a record of this kind of little pink and blue ribbons and little cuddly babies and little infants and so on being reverenced as infants as such. But what we don't realize that came along with that is a radical underestimation of what we are as human beginners, as human babies. Essentially, these children, these little babies, these little pink and blue creatures, were regarded as helpless, were regarded as without knowledge, without learning, little ignorant little creatures. You know, they were just, and so you begin to get a bunch of modifying adverbs and nouns and adjectives to these creatures. In other words, I saw just recently a depiction of Mozart in which he said Mozart began playing in public when he was only 6 years old. The lethal word in that sentence is the word only, because it implies, you see, that as only 6 years old, he shouldn't be able to do anything. He shouldn't have any of these abilities. And so the extraordinary thing was that this one genius knew how to play in public music when he was 6 years old, you see. And so there's a kind of stripping this child of a native ability that he has by that one lethal word. One client of mine recently talked about his own childhood. What is Billy doing? Oh, he's only reading. And that was dismissed as such, you see. And there's a kind of dismissal of what a child is doing. You'll see it in another way, which I routinely run into, when people talk about their children being extraordinary. Recently, I was in an airport watching a little creature wrestle with the luggage that we were waiting for, and there were some bags on the ground. I couldn't tell whether it was a boy or a girl because of the haircut, but I watched for a while. And I went to the mother and I said, "Do you mind if I say something to you?" And she said, "No, not at all." I said, "Is that a little boy or a little girl?" She said, "It's a little girl." I said, "Well, I've been watching her for a while, and I must tell you that when a little child, and she was no more than 2.5 feet tall, acts the way she is, she's really brilliant. I hope that in the future you will answer all her questions." Well, of course, the mother was smiling because she was hearing something positive. But what she said to me was very telling. She said, "Yeah, sometimes she frightens me." Because what she was indicating, what this mother was indicating, benign as she was, positive towards her daughter as she was that the daughter, asking intelligent questions, probing, knowing, being as smart as she was acting in a way unexpectedly. Little children don't act that way, you see. So the concept of childhood, babyhood, this kind of idea of little ignorant creatures that we created in the 19th century, is a radical stripping of children of what they really are, would be my argument. In other words, we don't recognize. Now, actually, there's some historical justification for looking at this way, because prior to that invention of childhood, what children were looked at essentially was regarded as human adults in the making. So it's an incomplete adult. Now, that doesn't imply, as is often taken in by people who are victimized by this present concept of babyhood, infanthood, that kids are pushed, that they're essentially manipulated into being what they're not. In other words, what was essentially taken for granted prior was that this was an adult in the making, and that this creature, boy or girl, was on the way towards learning how to be a human, quite analogously to how those elephants are learning to be elephants. And that's what I'm driving at. In other words, there's a posture in us when we're born that we're ready to learn how to become adult human beings. My suspicion, I don't know exactly whether I want to argue this as a fine point. My present theory is that it takes about 18 years. If elephants take 14 years, we're a lot more complicated than the elephants, and we learn much more subtly. So I would say 18 or 19 is probably the threshold where we graduate into what I would call an adult human being. If that's so, what we're talking about then is the process that we go through during those 18 or 19 years, essentially to learn to be ourselves. And what I would argue about that is that if we begin to look sensitively and with precision at that process, we discover that it's a multidimensional process that needs to be respected in some fundamental way. In other words, we know that children are looking and watching, and that the visual learning that they take in is very important and is to be taken seriously. But we also know that there's intellectual learning, that kids are formulating ideas for themselves. What I like to say to any client of mine who's about to be a new parent is, look, as an adult, you will have a tremendous impact on your child. But don't forget that's a little independent source of its own interpretation, which is essentially learning to do that more and more. And don't forget that that child is formulating his or her own points of view, own judgments and reactions to what is going on. But there's also an emotional dimension to this, which is radically underestimated, undervalued. In other words, the impact of the feeling of the child that anything an adult does is radically important here and is often ignored. The tone of voice that is used, the words that are used, the attitude that is taken has a tremendous impact on the creature that this child wants to become and needs to be taken radically seriously. And I think one of the worst areas that is underestimated. In other words, when we're using the word learning for a child that's learning to be an adult, the physical aspect of the learning, the visual aspect of the learning, the intellectual aspect of the learning, the emotional aspect of the learning must all be taken into account, because it's at that level that we have opted in evolution to become ourselves. That's how we become the creatures of learning. That's how we become the ones who could be flexible enough to learn how to fly. What's a human being doing? Flying like an eagle. We fly a lot further and far faster than any eagle because we learned how to do it. There's nothing about the human body that adapts it to flying. Yet we routinely take flying for granted these days and fly all over the world, all right? Fly at each other, whatever, you see, because that kind of learning is absolutely native to us. Now that means that the way I would argue it, and we will repeat something about this as we go along, is that the most important dimension of childhood experience, in my view, is the feeling of being gotten. I often say that to my clients. They respond to it immediately. To be understood, to be taken in, to be seen for what you're really feeling and really doing, to be embraced, to be known, to feel like you as you are welcomed into the world, something of that sort. And I would argue that this multidimensional, very complex creature is essentially listening for that kind of welcoming from the caregivers, from the adults, from the creatures that are responsible for bringing it to adulthood. And that when we're talking about this aspect of ourselves in childhood, we're coming very, very close to what is central to any kind of subsequent emotional problem, any kind of difficulty with learning life. To say this another way, I would argue that the reason any of us has any difficulty in living our subsequent lives is because in this multidimensional way, we have somehow been misinstructed as to how to live our lives, as to how to be ourselves. In other words, did I get some information? Did I get no information? Did I get a lot of information? How much misinformation did I get? Is the question. And I think it's that kind of examination that we want to do for investigating how to live our lives well, for investigating what kind of emotional problems need to be treated in good therapy.